You will regret me tonight.
What do you mean by that?
"You'll regret choosing me tonight," the giant bride said to the rancher. He smiled and said, "I already regret waiting this long. You'll regret choosing me tonight." The giant bride's words hit like a gunshot across the crowded saloon, her powerful frame towering in that blood-red dress as every rough man in Copper Ridge stopped drinking to watch Thea Hartwell tell the rancher he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. She stood 6'1" of raw muscle and barely contained rage, her hands clenched at her sides, her voice shaking not with fear, but with the kind of fury that comes from being broken too many times by men who promised forever and delivered hell. Silas Brennan, the stone-faced rancher who hadn't smiled in 3 years, who'd buried his wife screaming, who'd placed that strange advertisement every woman rejected, stood 3 feet away with his hat in his hands, surrounded by a circle of witnesses who'd come to watch him claim his mail-order bride, or watch her destroy him in front of the whole damn territory. The fiddle player had gone silent. The bartender had stopped pouring. Even the prostitutes on the stairs had frozen mid-step because Thea Hartwell, the woman they'd been whispering about all week, had just done the unthinkable. She'd warned her husband away on their wedding night in public, wearing a dress that said she wasn't anybody's property, standing tall when every woman in 1883 was supposed to bow her head and obey. "You'll regret choosing me tonight," she said again, louder this time, making sure every soul in that saloon heard her, making sure there were witnesses when this rancher realized what he'd bought, making sure he couldn't later claim he didn't know, couldn't say she'd tricked him, couldn't drag her through what her first husband had done, the public examination, the doctor's declaration, the legal documents that called her defective, barren, worthless, less than a woman. Her first husband had divorced her in front of a judge and filed papers with the county clerk so everyone would know why. Examined by medical professionals, womb declared damaged, incapable of bearing children, proven defective. She'd spent 4 years carrying that shame like a noose around her neck, and she'd be damned if she'd let another man discover her secret in the dark and call her a liar come morning. But Silas Brennan didn't curse, didn't demand his money back, didn't turn to the crowd and ask if anyone knew a lawyer who could undo a marriage in less than 6 hours. Instead, this rancher, this man whose eyes had been dead since the day he buried his family, whose hands bore scars from hitting walls when the grief got too heavy, whose reputation said he'd rather die alone than risk loving again, did something nobody expected. He smiled, not the polite smile of a man trying to save face, not the cruel smile of a man about to humiliate a woman in public, but a real smile, slow and certain and devastating, like Thea Hartwell had just said the exact words he'd been praying 3 years to hear. "I already regret waiting this long," Silas said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. And before she could process what that meant, before she could run or fight or demand an explanation, the rancher crossed those 3 feet of dusty floor, took her hand right there in front of everyone, and pulled his giant bride into a dance, not a gentle waltz, not a careful, respectful distance, but close, his scarred hand firm on her waist, her palm pressed against his chest, where she could feel his heart slamming just as hard as hers, moving together as the fiddle player nervously started up again, swaying to music that felt more like a challenge than a celebration. The crowd erupted in whispers. The prostitutes gasped. The bartender shook his head like he was watching 2 people jump off a cliff together. And Thea Hartwell, the giant bride in the crimson dress, who'd just warned her husband he'd regret choosing her tonight, found herself dancing with a man who was smiling like she'd just set him free instead of cursing him, who was holding her like she was precious instead of defective, who was moving with her across that floor like her barrenness wasn't a flaw, but exactly what he'd been searching for. And she didn't understand, couldn't understand. Why would any man smile when you told him you were broken? "Listen to me," Thea hissed as they turned, her voice desperate, trying one last time to make him understand before it was too late. "Tonight, when we're alone, When you touch me and realize I can't give you sons, can't give you heirs, can't give you what every man needs from a wife, you will regret choosing me. My body's broken, Silas, examined and declared defective by doctors. I have the papers to prove it. Papers I carry, so I'll never forget what I am. I know, he said simply, pulling her closer as the music swelled. Why do you think I chose you? She stumbled. He caught her. The dance never stopped. What? Your letter told me you were barren. That a doctor examined you. That your husband divorced you for it. His voice dropped lower, words meant only for her. And when I read those words, Thea, I didn't reject your letter. I burned every other one. Because you're the only woman in this territory who can give me what I actually need. Which is... His jaw clenched. His hand tightened on her waist. And when he spoke, his voice cracked with 3 years of buried grief. A wife who can never die giving birth to my child. The giant bride in the crimson dress stopped breathing. The saloon spun around her, but she couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except stare up at this rancher who'd just turned her greatest shame into his salvation. The music kept playing, but she didn't hear it anymore. The crowd kept watching, but she didn't see them. There was only Silas Brennan and the devastating truth written across his face. He hadn't chosen her despite being barren. He'd chosen her because of it. What happened? She whispered, "Not here." His eyes flicked to the watching crowd. "Not with them listening. Tell me, tonight. When we're alone, I'll tell you everything." He turned them one more time, his hand steady on her waist even though his voice was breaking. "But Thea, you need to understand something right now. Before we leave this saloon, before we go back to my ranch. You think I'm going to regret choosing you tonight. But the truth is..." He stopped dancing, held her still in the center of the floor, looked into her eyes with an intensity that made her chest ache. "The truth is, I've been regretting every single day for 3 years that I didn't find you sooner." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these people who'd spent the last week whispering about the giant bride and the broken rancher, taking bets on how long the marriage would last, laughing about 2 desperate fools who thought they could build something real out of their mutual damage. "I don't understand you," Thea said quietly. "I know. But you will." Silas released her waist, offered his arm like a gentleman. "Come home with me. Let me show you why choosing you tonight is the only thing I've done right in 3 years. She looked at his arm, at the scars on his knuckles, at the wedding ring he'd put on her finger 6 hours ago in a ceremony so quick she'd barely had time to say the words. Then she looked at the crowd watching them, waiting to see if she'd run or stay, if she'd prove them right or shock them all. Thea Hartwell took his arm. They walked out of that saloon together, the giant bride and the broken rancher, and the door swung shut behind them with a finality that felt like a choice neither of them could take back. Outside, the Arizona night was cool and dark, stars scattered across the sky like broken glass. Silas's horse waited at the hitching post, patient and steady. He helped her up. Didn't ask if she needed help. Just offered his hand and let her decide, and then swung up behind her, his arms coming around to hold the reins. Surrounding her with his presence, his warmth, his steady breathing, they rode in silence toward his ranch. Thea could feel the questions building in her throat, pressing against her teeth, demanding answers. But something in the set of his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched, told her to wait. Whatever he had to tell her, whatever had happened 3 years ago, it wasn't something that could be shouted over the sound of hoofbeats and wind. The ranch appeared as they crested a small rise. A modest house, barn, fences that looked well-maintained even in the darkness. And there, off to the left under a massive cottonwood tree, 2 small white crosses gleamed in the moonlight. Thea's breath caught. Silas felt it, felt the way she stiffened in front of him. "That's where they're buried," he said quietly. "My wife Sarah and our son." He never even drew breath. The horse stopped at the barn without being told. Like it knew this ritual, knew that when Silas brought someone to the ranch, he always paused here first. Always made them see the graves before they saw anything else. He dismounted, then helped Thea down, his hands careful on her waist. "Come," he said, and walked toward the cottonwood tree. Thea followed, her crimson dress dragging through the dust, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She stopped beside him at the graves, read the inscriptions carved into the simple wooden crosses. Sarah Brennan, beloved wife. Baby Brennan, taken too soon. She wanted a baby, Silas said, his voice flat, emotionless, like he'd told this story so many times in his head it had worn smooth. Wanted it more than anything. I was scared. She was small, delicate, and the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride. But she begged, and I loved her. So I said yes. He paused, swallowed hard. The labor went on for 2 days. 2 days of her screaming. 2 days of me holding her hand and promising it would be okay. 2 days of watching her bleed and knowing I'd killed her. That baby, our son, he was too big. Ripped her apart from the inside. By the time the doctor arrived, there was nothing he could do. I held her while she died. Held my son's body after. And I swore, his voice broke completely. I swore I would never do that to another woman. Never risk another life for something as stupid as wanting children. Thea stood frozen, tears streaming down her face now, not caring who saw. Silas. So when your letter came, he continued, turning to face her, when you told me you were barren, that you'd been examined and declared incapable of having children, I didn't see a broken woman. I saw salvation. I saw a chance to have a partner, a wife, someone to build a life with, without the constant terror of killing her. He reached out, wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. You think I'm going to regret choosing you tonight? Thea, you're the only woman in this territory I can be with without fear. The only woman I can touch without hearing Sarah's screams. The only woman I can love without it feeling like murder. The giant bride stared at the rancher, and everything she thought she understood about shame and brokenness and what made a person valuable shifted beneath her feet, like the desert sand. She'd spent 4 years believing her barrenness made her worthless. But to this man, standing in front of his wife's grave, it made her precious. You really chose me because I can't have children, she whispered. I chose you because with you I can finally breathe again. The house smelled of cedar and old grief. Thea stood in the doorway while Silas lit lamps, watched the warm light spread across walls that hadn't known a woman's touch in 3 years. Everything was clean but sparse, a man's space functional, empty of the small comforts that made a place a home. No curtains on the windows, no flowers in jars. No photographs on the walls, just furniture and necessity and the heavy silence of someone who'd stopped living and started surviving. Your room's upstairs, Silas said, setting down the last lamp.
Left side.
Door locks from the inside, Thea blinked. We're not tonight. His voice was firm but gentle. You've had a long day. Hell of a week. You deserve rest, not expectations. But your brother, she forced the words out. You said he's contesting the will. Said he needs proof we haven't, that the marriage isn't. He needs proof we consummated it. I know. Silas ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion written in every line of his face. But Thea, I'm not going to touch you just to satisfy my brother's lawyers. If we, it'll be because you want to, not because we have to. She stared at him, this rancher who'd just upended everything she thought she knew about men and marriage and what was owed. You're willing to risk losing your ranch for that? I'm willing to risk everything to never become the kind of man who takes what isn't freely given. He met her eyes. My brother can contest all he wants. We'll figure it out. But I won't rush you, won't pressure you, won't make you feel like you owe me your body just because I gave you my name. Thea's throat tightened. She thought about her first husband, how he'd demanded his rights on their wedding night, despite her tears, despite her terror, despite the way she'd bled and hurt and begged him to stop. How he'd told her it was her duty, her purpose, the only thing she was good for until her womb proved otherwise. And here was Silas Brennan, offering her a locked door and space to breathe. I don't know what to do with kindness, she admitted quietly. I keep waiting for the trap. There's no trap. Just time. He gestured to the stairs. Go rest. There's fresh water in the basin, clean towels. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. Thea wanted to argue, wanted to demand they just get it over with so she'd know what kind of man he really was when the lights went out and the witnesses went home. But exhaustion pulled at her bones, and the way he was looking at her, patient, steady, with no hunger in his eyes, just quiet concern, made her believe him. She climbed the stairs. The room was small but clean. A bed, a dresser, a window overlooking the cottonwood tree and the graves below. On the dresser sat a basin of warm water, a folded towel, and something that made her breath catch, a single desert marigold in a small glass jar. Her fingers trembled as she touched the bright petals. Downstairs, she heard Silas moving through the house. The sound of boots on wood, the creak of a door, then silence. She waited for his footsteps on the stairs, for the testing of her doorknob, for the inevitable moment when kindness revealed itself as strategy. But the house stayed quiet. Thea washed her face in the basin, changed out of the crimson dress into the simple nightgown she'd packed, and sat on the edge of the bed. From her bag, she pulled a small leather journal, worn, stained, filled with 4 years of thoughts she'd never dared speak aloud. She opened to a fresh page and wrote, "He gave me a locked door. He gave me space. He told me about his wife's grave before he touched me. I don't understand mercy anymore. I've forgotten what it tastes like. But tonight, it tastes like desert marigolds and a man who chose barrenness over fear." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Thea lay down, pulled the quilt up to her chin, and waited for sleep that wouldn't come. Her mind kept circling back to the saloon, to the moment Silas had smiled, to the way he'd said, "I already regret waiting this long," like he'd been searching for her his whole life. To the graves under the cottonwood tree, and the way his voice had broken when he talked about Sarah's screams. She'd spent 4 years believing her barrenness was a curse. But what if it wasn't? What if it was just a fact, like being tall or strong or having green eyes? What if the curse was actually what her first husband and the doctors and the whole damn town had done, turning a medical condition into a moral failing, making her body everyone else's business, declaring her defective when she was just different? A soft sound from downstairs pulled her from her thoughts. She sat up, listening. There it was again, a muffled thud, like something hitting a wall. Thea got up, eased her door open, crept to the top of the stairs. The sound came again, harder this time. She descended slowly, bare feet silent on the wooden steps. The house was dark except for a sliver of light under a closed door. Silas's room, she guessed. She pressed her ear against the wood and heard it clearly now. The sound of fists hitting walls. The sound of a man trying to punch his way through grief. Sarah. His voice was raw, broken, barely recognizable. "God, Sarah, I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry." Another thud. Another. Thea's hand was on the doorknob before she could think better of it, pushing it open without knocking, without asking permission, because she recognized that sound. She'd made it herself in the months after the divorce, after the examination, after the town turned her into a spectacle. That was the sound of someone who couldn't carry the weight anymore. Silas stood with his back to the door, shirtless, his knuckles bloody, a crack in the wall where he'd been hitting it. His shoulders shook with sobs he was trying to muffle, failing, breaking apart in a room he thought was private. Silas, he spun, eyes wild, tear-streaked, and for a moment he looked terrified, not of her, but of being seen like this, vulnerable, destroyed, less than the strong. Steady rancher everyone expected him to be. "Don't," his voice cracked. "Thea, just go back upstairs, please. No, I don't want you to see me like this." "Why? Because strong men don't cry? Because grief is supposed to be quiet and convenient?" She stepped closer. "Silas, I've spent 4 years pretending I'm fine. Pretending my divorce didn't break me. Pretending the examination didn't make me want to die. I know what it looks like to fall apart. And I'm not leaving you alone in it." He turned away, pressed his bleeding hands against the cracked wall, his whole body trembling. "You don't understand. Today, marrying you, it should feel like moving on, like choosing life again. But all I can think about is that I buried Sarah 3 years ago, and now I'm bringing another woman into this house, into this bed, and what if... He couldn't finish. What if I die too? Thea finished quietly. He nodded, unable to speak. She crossed the room, stood behind him, close enough to feel the heat coming off his skin, close enough to see the scars on his back, old ones, faded from a childhood she knew nothing about. Silas, I can't die in childbirth, remember? That's why you chose me. I know. But my mind, it won't let go. It keeps showing me Sarah's face, her blood. The way she looked at me at the end, like she was sorry for dying. Like it was her fault I'd killed her. You didn't kill her. I got her pregnant. She wanted that baby. You said so yourself, and she died for it, because I was too weak to say no, too selfish to protect her from her own desires. He slammed his fist into the wall one more time, softer now, more defeated than angry. How do I do this, Thea? How do I let myself want you when wanting Sarah killed her? Thea reached out, touched his shoulder. He flinched but didn't pull away. You let yourself want me by remembering that I'm not Sarah, that my body can't betray me the way hers did, that the thing you're most afraid of can't happen with me. He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was so raw it hurt to hold his gaze. What if I can't? What if I touch you and all I see is blood? Then we stop, we go slow. We figure it out together. She took his damaged hands in hers, examined the split knuckles, the bruises forming. Where's your medical kit? Thea, you don't have to... Where is it? He gestured to a cabinet. She found the kit, made him sit on the edge of his bed, and knelt in front of him. The intimacy of the position wasn't lost on either of them. This giant bride in her nightgown, kneeling between the legs of the rancher she'd married 6 hours ago, cleaning blood from his knuckles with careful, gentle movements. Why are you being kind to me? Silas asked, his voice small, confused. Because you were kind first. Thea wrapped his hands in clean bandages, tied them off with practiced efficiency. Because you gave me a locked door and a marigold, instead of demands and expectations. Because you told me your worst fear before asking for anything. Because you're sitting here falling apart, and you still won't take what isn't offered. She stood, but didn't step away. They were close now, closer than they'd been even during the dance. She could see the pulse in his throat, the silver beginning to show in his dark hair, the exact moment when grief shifted into something else, something that looked like hope. I'm afraid of you, he admitted. I'm afraid of you too. Why? Because you're the first person who's looked at my brokenness and called it valuable. And if I let myself believe that, if I let myself trust you, and you change your mind, it'll destroy me worse than the divorce did. Silas stood slowly, towering over her even though she was 6'1", his bandaged hands hovering near her face, like he wanted to touch her but didn't dare. I won't change my mind. You don't know that, I do. Because, Thea, I've been looking for you for 3 years. I just didn't know it until I read your letter. She searched his face for lies, for the crack in the facade, for the moment when this would reveal itself as manipulation. But there was only honesty, raw and painful and real. What do we do now? She whispered. Now? He smiled, sad and small. Now we both go to our separate rooms. We lock our doors. We try to sleep. And tomorrow we start figuring out how 2 broken people build something whole. Thea nodded, started to turn away. But his voice stopped her. Thea? Yeah? Thank you for not leaving me alone in it. She looked back at him, this rancher standing in his damaged room with his bandaged hands and his tear-stained face, and felt something shift in her chest. Not love. It was too soon for that. But maybe the beginning of trust. You gave me space, she said. I gave you company. That's what partners do. Partners, he repeated, like he was testing the word. I'd like that. Thea left him then, climbed the stairs, locked her door. But this time, the lock felt less like protection and more like a promise that she was staying, that she was choosing this, that tomorrow she'd still be here. She lay in bed, listening to the house settle, and for the first time in 4 years, her barrenness didn't feel like a death sentence. It felt like the reason she was still alive. Morning came with the smell of coffee and something burning. Thea woke to smoke curling under her door, bolted downstairs to find Silas standing over a skillet of what used to be eggs, looking utterly defeated. "I can't cook," he said flatly. Despite everything, she laughed. "Move." They worked side by side in comfortable silence, her fixing breakfast while he set the table, their movements careful, respectful, learning the rhythm of sharing space. When they sat down to eat, Silas cleared his throat. "My brother's coming today. With his lawyers." Thea's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "How do you know?" "Got a telegram yesterday. He wants proof the marriage is legitimate, or he's filing to contest the will." His jaw clenched. "Thea, I won't let him examine you. I won't let anyone. Then we give him what he needs." She set down her fork, met his eyes. "We make this marriage real. Not because of him, not just because of him." Her voice was steady. "Last night I watched you fall apart. You watched me hold you together. That's more intimate than anything we could do in a bedroom." Silas stared at her. "You're sure?" "I'm terrified, but I'm sure." They didn't speak again until after breakfast. Thea washed dishes while Silas stood at the window watching the road. When she finished, he turned to her. "Upstairs," he said quietly. "Before I lose my nerve." His room was simple, clean, filled with morning light. Thea stood by the window while Silas locked the door, not to trap her, but to give them privacy. He moved to her slowly, hands shaking despite the bandages. "Tell me if you want to stop," he said. "Tell me if you see blood instead of me." They undressed each other carefully, learning scars and stories written in skin. When he touched her, his hands were gentle, reverent, and when she pulled him close, she felt his tears on her shoulder. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm alive. You're not killing me." What happened between them was awkward and tender and real. Two damaged people figuring out how to be close without fear, how to want without destroying, how to build intimacy from honesty instead of obligation. When it was over, they lay tangled together, breathing hard, both crying. "That wasn't about your brother," Silas said. "No, it was about us." Hours later, when his brother arrived with lawyers and demands, Silas met them at the door with Thea beside him. "The marriage is legitimate. We consummated it this morning. Now get off my land," his brother sneered. "She's barren, everyone knows. This marriage is a sham." "This marriage," Silas interrupted, his arm around Thea's waist, "is the realest thing I've done in 3 years. She's my wife, my partner, and her body is nobody's business but ours." The lawyers left. The brother left. And Thea and Silas stood on their porch, watching them disappear, knowing they'd won. "What now?" Thea asked. Silas smiled, real and warm. "Now we build a life, our way." That night they planted marigolds around Sarah's grave, not to forget, but to remember that grief and hope could grow in the same soil. And when they went to bed together, it wasn't about duty or fear or proving anything. It was about two people who'd found each other in the wreckage and decided to build something new. If Thea and Silas's story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales, where broken isn't the end, it's just the beginning. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because out here, love doesn't heal everything, but it makes carrying the weight a little easier.